Hello, everyone. Greetings from Dealey Plaza, UK. My name is Bart Kamp. Today's guest is Michael Kelly Marcades, also known as Rose Cherami's son. We were supposed to have him talk to us via Skype on the 21st. Today's the 27th. And regrettably, due to the coronavirus, we've had to cancel that. And we kept in touch and just decided to do the talk regardless and record it and share with everyone because everyone is sitting at home anyway. So now for those people that are a little bit familiar with the whole JFK shenanigans, the assassination as such, those that remember the Oliver Stone film recognize maybe the name Rose Cheramii from the movie, because she's actually in the very beginning of this film, and there are a couple of scenes of her. Number one is that she's being thrown out of a car on a deserted road, and the other main scene, is that she is under the influence of some medication, that she's basically lying on a stretcher inside of a hospital and predicts that something is going to happen, that they're going to try and kill Kennedy in Dallas beforehand. So, Michael.
Yes, good morning. Good afternoon.
Hi. Thank you for spending the time with us here online. And I would basically just, obviously you're aware of who your mother was before the JFK film came out. Do you remember when you saw this bit in the film?
I do remember seeing the film for the first time, and it was pretty much late in my adult life. I'm 67 now, so I guess I saw the film probably 20 or 25 years ago,
Yes.
and it had quite an impact on me, actually, both personally and from a research standpoint.
Right. Okay. Did Does it actually is it a truthful scenario that's being displayed as such?
Actually, it's as truthful as it could have been at the time. Unfortunately, Oliver Stone and his crew did not have access to any of the research, particularly the research that I've done in the past 20 years. I mean, it has been I believe it's been almost 30 years since Stone's JFK came out, and it's in the wake of that film that I have actually done the depth and breadth of my research. And some of the scenes in the film are accurate, some of the scenes are surmised. Right. So the scene about her being thrown out of a car, in my mind, is a made up scene. I'm sure at some point in time she was thrown out of vehicles by individuals, but it really is not an accurate scene as it relates to her experience at the Silver Slipper. I think it's during that event at the Silver Slipper that they're trying to refer. However, the scene of her in the hospital ranting and raving as she is trying to come down off of a heroin high is pretty accurate.
Right. Did you get this backed up by anyone who was around that time?
Yes, there are physicians involved in the hospital at the time. Lieutenant Francis Frigé, also the Louisiana State Drug Enforcement Department confirms all of that particular scene that's in the hospital. In fact, Francis Frigé spent quite a bit of time with my mother after that particular scene and got the entire picture from her as he was taking her to a hospital in Jackson, Louisiana.
Right.
But as far, it's unfortunate that all the research that I've done wasn't really available to him at the time. I'm really hoping, I think we have about, I think we have 5 producers looking at my second revised edition right now. So hopefully we'll be able to get that launched and square away some of those particulars. But I must say that I was absolutely flabbergasted that Oliver Stone, out of all of the characters that he could include in his limited time in his JFK film presentation, that he included Rose Cherami. That's rather stunning to me.
Yes, of course. That is quite a thing. Um, would you just can we just go back to the beginning of the moment where you basically decided to start to research your mom as such? And from what I gather is that it was your aunt that gave you a envelope full of documents.
Actually, it was an old grocery sack. You know,
Right.
long ago, there was no such thing as saving something on a disk or whatever, or a thumb drive. And so, you know, people held on to important documents by placing them in a drawer or placing them in a sack. And actually, I was handed, when my maternal grandparents passed away, my aunt handed me 2 grocery sacks full of all kinds of things, documents, handwritten letters, photographs, and what have you. And at the time, I had no idea the impact that they would have on my life. And I certainly had no idea that they would serve as the foundation for the research that I do for the next 30 years. But if those 2 sacks of documents, et cetera, had not been held on to by my family, it would have been impossible to launch the research, particularly the value of the handwritten letters. I mean, they are just incredibly important and give me direct insight into Mother's personal thoughts through different times in her life. So I'm very grateful for that.
Right. Can you tell me a bit more about these letters?
The letters, all of these letters chronicle where she was at the time she was writing. I know that may seem obvious to everyone, but Mother's whereabouts 99% of the time were unknown to her family once she left home. She was very particular about communicating her location. The deeper she got into the system, into the drug scene, the prostitution rings across the U.S., etc., and particularly after she gave birth to me, I think she was genuinely aware that she was working with some really bad people, and that there is nothing they would not do to get her to behave in a manner that they chose, including threatening her family and particularly threatening me. So the letters confirm by the postage stamp on the envelope confirms her location, confirms her actions in those locations. And so it really fit in nicely into my research timeline.
Right. Did you, okay, for your research, obviously you had to travel for that. Where did you actually go for that particular research?
Well, I did quite a bit of research in New Orleans, particularly at the specific location of the Blue Angel, where my dad watched my mother perform on stage. And a lot of my family history is indeed in New Orleans. When I was almost 40 years old, that's where I discovered my father, whom I had never met. All of the reasons why I'd never met him are just based on idiotic family particularities, wanting to close the door on him being in my mother's life, although he was a wonderful person, from what I can tell. So I met him, and I discovered 3 half brothers in New Orleans, and of course spent extensive time on Bourbon Street doing research about what Mother did, how they connected, etc. And I have been to hospitals where she was hospitalized.
Right.
Austin State Hospital in Austin, Texas, Gladewater Hospital out in East Texas, of course, a very important location for her. I have not been at the other hospitals. I've not been able to get out to Washington to go to St. Elizabeth's, and I have not been at Norman, Oklahoma at Central State. But confirming her admission to Central State is actually a rather recent discovery. It was less than a year ago that I discovered documents that indeed prove that she was present there during the MK Ultra experiments that went on at Central State. And it's also a time where Lee Harvey Oswald had applied for employment at the very same hospital at the time Mother was hospitalized. So I've gone to as many locations as humanly possible. Of course, I've been to her gravesite, and I guess that about covers locations where I've traveled.
Right. What I find interesting about your is the different angle that you have to go for, because everybody else into JFK assassination research will have to go to an archive of some sort, yet you had to go for hospitals to basically get these documents. I'm amazed you managed to get hold of these documents, by the way.
Well, let me not, I don't mean to misinform. It was not an easy process. The documents that I acquired from Gladewater Hospital were extremely difficult to get my hands on, and were it not for the help of Gary Shaw, whom the world, I guess, knows as one of the most important first-generation researchers related to the assassination. And of course, I went in tow with my lawyer, and it actually took us about 5 hours to get our hands on the documents in the hospital. And oddly, Mother's documents, if you go to a hospital looking for documentation, you go to the records department and you expect that records would be sequestered, in an alphabetized system, in a file cabinet, etc. That's not exactly what I discovered at Gladewater Hospital. And my presence in the hospital actually caused quite a bit of stir. The people who were on the first floor who were trying to handle me and my lawyer and Gary Shaw, of course, had communicated with people upstairs, so to speak, that I was in the hospital and demanding release of the medical records for my mother. And it took us, as I said, over 5 hours to get them. And the most important thing about that is once permission was given to the medical records personnel to hand them over to me, Mother's records were not in a file cabinet. The person who actually handed them over to me actually moved to the back side of the office, pulled a desk from out up against the wall, and retrieved Mother's hospital records, which had been hidden behind a desk for God knows how long.
Nothing suspicious there, that's for sure.
Nothing suspicious, no.
Exactly. Wow, that's quite a thing.
But those records, I've held on to those records for well over 25 years, and only in my second edition of my book am I releasing them within the document section. And the reason is because the death certificate, as most of your listeners probably already know, has DOA stamped at least twice, sometimes three. By the way, I have two, quote, original death certificates. DOA is stamped all over them, and yet I uncovered at Gladewater over 8.5 hours of minute-by-minute medical attention given to my mother. So she obviously was not dead when she arrived at the hospital. I mean, they even included setting her forearm, which was broken. But the most important thing about that document is the statement in black and white that Mother was the victim of a punctate stellate wound, which many people in the JFK assassination community surmised that terminology was made up. Well, it was not made up. It was clearly typed and handwritten in the medical records. And I think I've visited with over a dozen physicians over the past 25, 30 years, and all of them have said punctate stellate wound most commonly refers to a gunshot wound, close range gunshot wound, and in Mother's particular situation, a gunshot wound to the head. So obviously she did not die from an auto accident at the hands of Jerry Dunmore. Actually, Jerry Dunmore was an angel in disguise in the middle of East Texas on that fateful night, who actually was brave enough to stop and attend to her. Excuse me, attend to her. It was the gunshot wound that was Mother's primary source of harm.
Wow.
Even to the point that Mr. Shaw and I have talked repeatedly about whether or not we should exhume Mother's body in search of the metal that would indeed back that up, even on another level. But for many, many reasons, we've elected not to do that. I believe the medical records are sufficient to answer that question. And, there are people out there who, some of whom may end up listening to our interview today, who know the truth. Oddly, I have received so many random communications via email and via Facebook. 2 decades ago, I received an email from halfway around the world, and all the email said was, if you could know the truth about what happened to your mother, what would you do with the information? And secondly, one day on Facebook, I got a message from someone who had responded to some posts about my book. And she said, yes, indeed, I knew her and loved her very much, indeed idolized her, and yes, they murdered her. So there are still people out there who know, probably the exact individual who committed the crime.
Did you get into did you get in contact with these people that have been talking to you like that?
Yes, I did. I did visit with the gentleman who was in Denmark and did not, he did not come through with the kind of answers that I wanted. Some people are just really scared to communicate about this subject for obvious reasons. And the woman, it's impossible to get in the actual contact information of someone on Facebook. I immediately answered her, gave her my name, told her I was Cherami's sole son, and asked her to get back in touch with me, but I sadly never heard back from her.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Now, can you highlight a little bit about the relationship she had to crime? Now, there's talk of, because that's how it starts off with. She's actually pushed out of a car by 2 criminals. So what is her role actually in this JFK assassination thing and the crime thing as such? What is actually her position?
Yeah, in order to answer that question, you have to look at Mother's very lengthy rap sheet, which incorporates somewhere between 30 and 35 aliases. And if you follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak, through that arrest record, you discover how Rose Cheramii, my mother, got deeper and deeper and deeper into the world of crime, drugs, and prostitution. In the past year, I've done extensive research about her involvement with Detective Bill Nitzer at the Houston Police Department. Are you familiar with that individual?
No.
Well, at the time that Mother first, first ran away from home, she got involved in drugs in the Houston area at a time when the Houston Police Department was indeed very, very corrupt. And the individual who was at the head of all the drug processing for the Houston Police Department was Detective Bill Nitzer. Mother wound up, he had observed Mother's work on the streets for quite a while, and eventually made contact with her and actually hauled her into the Houston Police Department. And at the time, Mother had a vial of heroin with her, and he used that as a means to demand her assistance. And for quite some time, she served as one of his primary informants regarding prostitution and mainly drugs in the Houston area. Right. But the Houston Police Department was known at the time and was indeed even being investigated by the CIA and the FBI for drugs coming in the front door and going out the back door for a huge profit. And in the middle of that investigation, Bill Nitzer was involved and questioned. And although he had done nothing wrong in comparison with everyone else within the Houston Police Department, evidently he was very concerned about what was being investigated. And at some point, my research proves that he is quoted to have committed suicide in his office by shooting himself 2 times in the exact same location in his heart.
Oh, that's amazing.
And on that particular day, Mother was actually waiting for him to show up for their regularly scheduled meeting. And of course, he never showed up. And the way she learned about his demise was from reading the newspapers the next day and the following weeks, which I've read many articles about what happened to Bill Nitzer that day. But it's at that point, once you realize that Mother is that deep, and you do continued research about who was running all these drug shipments around the world and who was monitoring shipments that were coming in at seaports, particularly like in New Orleans and in the Houston, the Bay Area, you discover that the mob, of course, is involved in all of this. And those were indeed the bosses that were giving Mother her instructions through lower people, like Jack Ruby at the point near the time of the assassination. But there were other bosses who were sending her from the East Coast to the West Coast, delivering drugs, running prostitution rings. And by the time we get to the Kennedy time, excuse me, the Kennedy assassination period, she was en route on a drug run from Miami to Dallas and was with 2 men who claimed that they were en route to Dallas to assassinate the president. And Mother was en route to Dallas to collect $8,000 for her work, quotedly and evidently to pick me up, which she used that as a lie to protect me, because by that time I was already in the safe care of my maternal grandparents. So, that's quite a bit of information there. Let me shut up and let you respond.
No, I'm listening. I love it, what you've got to say. So please do continue. Just the whole, of course, it's the element that ties the crime element, and the fact that she was thrown out the car, or metaphorically in that movie, and that she just basically predicted. So she must have been close to some sort of source that basically talked about it. What have you found out about anything in regards to that?
Well, first of all, you need to take the scene in JFK about her being thrown out of the car with a huge block of salt.
Yeah.
The incident that truly matters in my mind is the day she was en route through Texas and came through outside of Eunice and stopped at the Silver Slipper with 2 men who were involved in prostitution and drug running. And while they were at the Silver Slipper, Mother was evidently there for prostitution reasons and delivering of drugs. And she wound up getting inebriated at that place and started mouthing off. And this has all been proven not only by me, but by Frege and Garrison and others. We have documents proving that she was there and that she was mouthing off. They got pissed at her, beat her up a little bit and drug her out of the establishment and threw her into the parking lot. Right. And it's from that point forward that she started stumbling down the highway trying to hitchhike and to get to Dallas on her own. And that's where Frank Odom, who wasn't really paying attention to what he was doing when he was driving, looked down or at his dashboard or something, and the next thing he knows, he hears a thump that has hit his car, and he has managed to bump Mother while she was walking on the side of the road.
Right.
So that is the scene that would have been much better to have included in the film, in my humble opinion. I mean, Oliver Stone can do whatever he chooses, but that would have been the scene that was unknown to everyone in 1999. That would have been a lot more accurate.
Right. Okay. And regarding the prediction of the assassination as such,
Yes.
what did you find? I mean, the sources where she got this from. Do you know anything about this, or was it just that she just said it on while she was on that gurney, and that's it? Or is there any additional stuff that you found out?
Well, after the sequence of events, once she was taken to that hospital and was ranting, coming down off of heroin, she began to warn people even then. And of course, no one paid attention to her. They figured this was just the rantings of someone who was high. And after all, by that time in her life, Mother's rap sheet was indeed quite long. So who's going to pay much attention to a mainline heroin addict prostitute?
Yeah.
And so what happened thereafter was, after the assassination actually took place, of course, Fruget had visited with her at the hospital, and then had, in Eunice. She could not stay in Eunice because she had no means of paying for medical treatment. So the process described in the book is Fruget carts her to the state hospital, and en route, she tells him all of these things that she knows. And of course, Fruget was an expert in dealing with people who were hooked on heroin and had, interrogated them through the process of coming down off of heroin. And so he was able to discern when she was making sense, when she was not. And it was during that time that she shared all of this information with Fruget. He didn't really pay that much attention to it, but obviously logged it in the back of his mind. Once she arrived at the hospital, she was admitted there. Fruget went on about his business. And then the day came when people were watching the reports of the assassination on television and listening to the words of Walter Cronkite. And there were physicians and nurses and indeed patients in the room with Mother while they were watching the television. And Mother starts telling them, well, this is where it's going to happen. And of course, we all know that there was no such thing as watching the events live then. We were watching, taped accounts of that. And once Mother started speaking in those terms, well, they recontacted Fruget. And of course, he came back to visit with her after she was much healthier. And so, the scenes that Fruget and Mother went through together are quite lengthy. Even going to Houston to check on a drug shipment that was coming in that was proven Mother had told all of the exact right information about that. And unfortunately, by the time Garrison gets around to researching all of this, Mother, of course, had already been eliminated. So.
Right. What did Garrison exactly do?
Pardon me? You broke up.
Sorry about that. What did Garrison exactly do, investigation-wise?
Well, they all knew about the reports that Cheramii had offered at the time, and his investigators, rather quickly found out that Mother was dead, a victim of auto accident, and of course there wasn't much left to do at that point about contacting her. But he did visit with Fruget. Fruget went through the entire account of all of it, and there are documents that I've included in my book that show the exact interview manuscripts, etc. Confirming all that Garrison did at the time to try to track her down.
Right. Okay. Now, obviously, you started researching a few decades ago. Did you start researching before or after when the film JFK came out?
Long before.
Long before.
Yeah. I did minimal research when I was a young man in my 20s. By the time I got to my 30s, I started taking it a little more seriously.
Right.
And then after I had my initial conversation with Gary Shaw and Joe West, they came to visit my aunt and uncle, Morris and Moselle Wall. And my aunt and uncle called me and said, we have two gentlemen who want to come to North Dallas to visit with us to tell us information about your mother, and we need you to come. And so on that day, that's the first day that I was actually exposed through Gary Shaw and Joe West to everything about Mother's involvement, her very surreptitious events in East Texas when she was supposedly killed, and at that point, I did not begin my research there, but I was just too young. But the older I got, the more important it was for me to get to know my mother as best as I could. And the only way I could do that was to begin this long journey of research into discovering everything that I possibly could about her.
So, you then start researching. You've done it for, as you say, for quite a while, quite a few decades. But yet it took you quite a long time to actually release your first volume of your book.
It did, and honestly, I really did not set out to write a book at all, Bart. What I set out to do was to discover truth about my mother. And since I grew up without her and only remember seeing her 2 or 3 times as a child, the last event being seeing her in the casket at her funeral, I just, after I had my own children, I just made up my mind that I was going to do everything I could to get to know my mother, no matter how bad, how brutal, or how sad the circumstances were. And indeed, they are sad. But with every new discovery, I actually got to know my mother much better. And eventually I found my father in New Orleans. And 6 months after I found him, he died of a brain tumor. Had I waited 6 months, 1 week long, I would have never even met him. And so he pieced together many facets of his connection with mother, their rather rough divorce, the insistence that he stay out of my life, things like that. So the first edition, by the time I published the first edition, I believe I had been working at researching my journal, which my wife had encouraged me to do, to document everything that I've discovered in the right historical sequence. That's even at that time, I had not made up my mind that I was going to write a book. But the farther I got into it, I ran into individuals, particularly Chris Gallup, who is a relatively well-known researcher in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
He does that luncheon thing, doesn't he?
Yes, that's the first time that I had actually spoken in public about anything that I had done. And once Chris had discovered I now call it my full manuscript, which was my first draft of the book, he shared it with Deborah Conway, with Lancer Publications, and that's how the first publication of that story actually began and occurred.
Right. Okay, so you released your book. Was it 3 years ago?
2016, November 2016.
Right, so three and a half years ago. No, it's 4. My question is this: you just released your second volume. It's
Yes.
a revised edition. Um, any chance you can tell me, like in bullet points, like what progress you've made in that period of time? I mean, hold on, before I actually ask you that, is actually what made you released the book, and what shortly after you came across more evidence that basically spurred you to make an updated edition this quick after?
Yes. Actually, when I published the first edition, I knew I wasn't finished with the research. There were facets of Mother's life, mainly her hospitalizations, that were extremely important, and I'll get to enumerating those in just a moment. But I also had known about her serving as a primary informant for Detective Billnitzer with the Houston Police Department. So I had 5 hospitalizations and that one huge connection to the Houston PD that I knew I had not finished, but I didn't have the documentation to complete the research. The second aspect of this is by the time I actually got the book published in 2016, I had rewritten the book 4 times already.
Oh my God.
So I was completely exhausted. And so I really had to take some time off. But less than 2 years ago, actually this past year, 2019, excuse me, and the end of 2018 were hugely important in terms of my research about those 5 hospitalizations and her work with Bill Nitzer in Houston. Um, and all of those documents, I mean, it's unbelievable. About 6 months ago, I was able to uncover documentation that confirmed her first hospitalization at the Austin State Hospital in connection with the Sealy Hospital system. And when she was diagnosed as having sociopathic personality disturbance and, of course, alcoholism. She was there, it documented that she was indeed there at that hospital in March of 1956 and released in April of 56. And I uncovered quite a few sheets of documentation about how she was treated there. I didn't even know about this hospitalization. So that discovery was hugely important. But there are other hospitalizations, all of her hospitalizations at East Louisiana State, her being administered to with electroshock therapy, documentations of my grandparents giving handwritten signature permission for that to occur. And she was in East Louisiana twice, once in 1961 and once in 1963. But I also discovered documentation proving that she was at Central State Mental Hospital in Norman, Oklahoma, which is now called the Griffin Memorial Hospital System. Excuse me. Now, the documentation that I discovered there is 56 years old.
Amazing.
Yes, and as I said earlier in our interview, this was a time at Central State when in the MK Ultra mind control process was underway under the leadership of Dr. West. Unfortunately, I did not uncover a document that had his signature on it, but I did uncover documentation proving that she was at Central State during the time that West was there. And also, as I said earlier, a time when Lee Harvey Oswald had applied for a job there in the summer of 1963. So that hospitalization was extremely important. The documents from East Louisiana, extremely revelatory about treatments that she was given. But the hospitalizations that are really most interesting to me are St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C., and Gladewater Hospital. I mean, why in the world was a heroin prostitute assigned being admitted to St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C.? That's a hospital that's reserved for only the most elite in our armed forces and
Right.
FBI and CIA, yet she was hospitalized there for 2 years. And the only people who ever came to visit Mother while she was at St. Elizabeth's was my uncle, Jackson W. Stewart, who was Colonel Jackson Stewart. In the time, he was the only person who was allowed to visit her with his wife and only child in tow with him. I mean, it's just unbelievable that she was hospitalized there. So those records, which I indeed have in my possession, are unbelievable. So there's 5 hospitalizations that the new edition covers uh, that I just did not have access to the right research for the first edition. That's Austin State Hospital, 2 admissions to East Louisiana State Hospital, the single admission to Central State in Norman, Oklahoma, and the admission to St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C.
Okay, got it. What about the obviously these hospital records are incredibly valuable as to like how many times she was in there and what for, etc., and where she was. What about the trail of the crime element, where basically she managed to gain that foreknowledge of the assassination as such? Is
Well,
there anything that you found out about that more in more detail?
yes, the interesting thing about Mother's life is that while she was being used by all of these bosses within the mob system, etc., Mother was considered to be little more than trash to them. In fact, I've had someone put in writing that the day she was murdered, that whoever processed this didn't really look at her as a human being, but as merely an assignment, like little more than taking out the trash. And so when she was working for Jack Ruby in Dallas, she was both seen and unseen. So no one ever worried about what they said around her because she was of little value and of little consequence. But she heard a lot, particularly when she was working in the Ruby Carousel Club.
Mm.
She confirms that she not only knew Jack Ruby, knew Lee Harvey Oswald, but they knew each other and were frequently together. And when she was on an airplane with Lieutenant Fruget earlier, she saw a newspaper headline that was even questioning the fact that whether or not they knew each other. She said, hell, they not only knew each other, they were bed partners. So she was alluding to the fact that they were possibly homosexually connected. So, it's just odd that Mother wound up being in the company of people who were involved in whatever you want to call it, conspiracy, plot, plan to eliminate JFK. In the final analysis, she was en route to Dallas with 2 men who were supposedly part of an assassination team. And they were mouthing off, again, about what their plan was in Dallas without giving much thought to the fact that Mother was even in their company. So I don't know if I'm answering your question
Yeah,
specifically.
I just wondered whether you were able to basically get more substantiation for this, in the sense that that you knew the names of the people that she was actually hanging out with, who told her this type of stuff, and that you managed to get hold of relatives or even the people themselves, and managed to talk to them as such.
Well, I
That's why.
do. I do have documents that prove all this. One of the wonderful things about Deborah Conway with JFK Lancer is that Deborah would not allow me to print my first edition without having documents in my possession that would prove such claims.
Right.
And I do have them. They vary from Warren Commission memorandum to FBI memorandum to Garrison memorandum to Fruget interviews. I mean, I have a 5-inch notebook full of documents that I have acquired over the past 25 or 30 years. And I stand by everything that I have written in all of my books about who she knew. I mean, even the manager of the Silver Slipper, Fruget went there, took with him a stack of photographs. The man who was in charge of the Silver Slipper was Manuel, and he looked at the photograph books that the mugshots that Fruget brought with him and confirmed that it was indeed Sergio Arcacha Smith and Emilio Santana, with whom Mother was traveling. And we already know that Smith and Santana were involved in some way. So what I can tell you that your listeners are probably most interested in is that I have in my hand document after document after document after document that support what I have written in both of my editions.
Okay, cool. Part of that question that I just asked was not just the documentation, but did you manage to talk to anyone basically involved in that segment of the play?
Unfortunately, no. At the time, I have not visited. I did not have a chance to ever visit with Garrison or Fruget, whom I believe obviously is deceased. By the time I got really serious about all of this, some of the main players were dead. I have tried desperately and traveled. You asked me about where did I go. I have traveled to East Texas desperately trying to locate Dr. McKenzie, who was one of the physicians, excuse me, who overheard Mother in the Musa Hospital, the Musa Memorial Hospital, Eunice, talking about things like this, so, and in East Louisiana State Hospital as well. But they're either hiding or gone. So it's just, we're just a long way out. And so it's documents have been extremely important. Talking to individuals is a rare thing.
Yeah, I know.
I believe people are still scared to death to convey anything they know.
Yeah, which is strange if you think about the amount of years that it has basically gone past. You'd think people would start talking, but
yeah, well, my God, over 100. We know of at least 100 people who, within less than 2 years of the assassination, strangely disappeared.
Yeah.
I've had numerous people ask me, "Look, aren't you worried for your personal safety or the safety of your children or extended family?" And I said, my point about that is, if something happens to me, it only adds to my credibility. So but
it's not a threat anymore either. That's the whole thing. Those people that were enforcing those methods back in the 60s and the 70s,
yes,
they're not around anymore. They're not in a position of power anymore either. So.
That's a wonderful observation. It's exactly true. Okay. So,
So your second volume is out now?
It is. I just
through
released.
Amazon?
Pardon me?
Through Amazon?
It is available through Amazon, but if people would like autographed copies, I'd like to encourage them to contact me via email, and I can give you that address. But also, I have just launched the rosecheramii.com website, which I think is an excellent source of information and a way for people to get in touch with me. If they wish to order autographed copies, they need to write me at michaelmarcades@gmail.com.
Duly noted.
Pardon me?
Duly noted.
Okay. And, it's interesting. Since I posted the Sixth Floor Museum interview, I have had a huge influx of interest and purchases. I've just held on to that interview for quite a while, for 3 or 4 years now, and just decided it was time to share it. But I am incredibly pleased with this second edition. I published it through my own company. P&L Limited LLC, which means I had complete control over every facet of the formatting and inclusion of documentation, et cetera. I mean, it took 5 months to format the second edition, even with the assistance of a professional formatter in Georgia. So I'm quite proud of it. The introduction is greatly expanded by J. Gary Shaw. So I think it's quite a document. And there's so many new things in there. I have newspaper articles regarding connection at Houston Police Department, in addition to all those medical documents. But I think I'm finally finished. The only thing that could be added would be the discovery of the exact name of the individual who put the gun to Mother's head outside of Gladewater in 1965. So, if that ever comes,
Are you close to finding that out, or
am I close to finding that out? I don't believe that name. I really don't believe that name is ever going to come forward.
Right.
I have talked to people behind bars that have confirmed that I am indeed on the right track, that Mother was murdered and it was covered up for the past 50 something years. But I believe that those individuals take care of each other, and I really doubt that the name of the person will very, very close. That is one remaining fact to be discovered, but I really believe I have unturned thousands of rocks in relation to this unbelievable saga. And the other thing about my book is that, most people don't know anything about Mother's life, her childhood. She contracted acute encephalitis when she was 12 years old. And the important fact about that is she was hospitalized for 30 days with high fever. And when she was finally released from the hospital, the physicians warned my grandparents that they should keep a close eye on my mother, especially during puberty and all the hormonal shifts that take place during that time, and above all, to keep her away from alcohol and drugs, because there was no absolute prediction about how she would respond to that. And of course, we all know that Mother was not kept away from drugs and alcohol. The impacts that they had on her were devastating. But the encephalitis situation, I believe 90% of the people around the world don't even know about that. Maybe 99. But my effort was to piece together her entire life, not just talk about her intersection with the assassination of Kennedy.
No. Okay. On that note, I'd like to thank you